The last Tsar of Russia came to power 1894. He was forced to abdicate the throne about 2 decades later in the Bolshevik Revolution, which was, of course was 100 years ago this year, one of our big global anniversaries this year, 1917, the Russian Revolution. We're now a century on from that. But as it happened in 1917, the Tsar and his family were scared off the throne that year. But then the revolutionaries didn't kill them right away. They kept them alive for a while. They kept them first in one of the Russian royal palaces that was just south of St. Petersburg. Then eventually they moved the Tsar and his family to another royal residence in Yekaterinburg, which is now the 4th largest city in Russia. In the summer of 1918, the Russian revolutionaries, the fighters that were holding the Tsar and his family in this residence in Yekaterinburg, they were worried that the counter-revolutionaries, that the loyalists of the Tsar's family were closing in on Yekaterinburg. They were worried, actually, that the Tsar and his family might somehow be rescued by those counter-revolutionary forces. They were worried that the revolution would be over, the monarchy would be restored. And so the people who were holding the Tsar and his family, they kind of freaked out. They held a secret meeting. They apparently took a vote. They decided to impose what amounted to an extrajudicial death sentence on the Tsar, but also on his entire family. On the night of July 16th, 1918, they put the Tsar and his wife and their kids and even their servants, put them all in the basement of the house where they had been holding them in Yekaterinburg, and they shot all of them. They killed the whole royal family and the servants who worked for them. And of course, the Soviet Union is what ultimately rose from the 1917 revolution, but the Tsar and the Russian monarchy still had its fans, even in Soviet days. And it was a constant source of worrying and even distress for the Soviet Union, for the Communist Party during Soviet days, that site in Yekaterinburg, where the Tsar and his family had all been killed in that basement, it was a constant source of worry to the Communist Party that site in that Russian city had become a place of reverence. It wasn't formally a memorial of any kind, but it basically became a pilgrimage site where people would come to remember what happened, to lament what happened. And as the Soviet Union and the Communist Party got increasingly annoyed by and worried about that, local officials in and around Yekaterinburg, they came under pressure to do something about it. And finally, in 1977, he was reluctant to do it. He had many second thoughts. In his heart of hearts, he really didn't want to do it. But in 1977, a local leader in Yekaterinburg, a local leader named Boris Yeltsin, did what the party in Moscow told him to do. He bulldozed the house. He bulldozed that house in Yekaterinburg where the Tsar and his wife and his kids and their servants were machine-gunned in the basement. They just ripped the whole thing down, destroyed it as a site. Now, Boris Yeltsin, of course, would later go on to become the first post-Soviet leader of the new Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he had long said that he regretted that decision back in Yekaterinburg, that it had weighed on him over the years. He regretted it. And once he became president of Russia, he rectified that decision. I mean, you can't unbulldoze anything. You can't rebuild what has been destroyed. You can't recreate history. But in 1998, Boris Yeltsin, then as president of Russia, he gave Tsar Nicholas II and his family a funeral, gave them a proper religious funeral. And then within a couple of years, they started construction on a fairly grand church on the site where the family had been murdered, where Yeltsin had previously ordered the house to be destroyed. They started the work on that church in 2000. It was completed by 2003. Even today, if you Google pictures of Yekaterinburg, just generically do a Google image search, what pops up are pictures of that church. It's very grand. It's covered in gilt, right? Gold domes, giant Orthodox crosses. And because it's Russia, it has a fittingly dramatic Russian name. It's called the Cathedral on the Blood. So Yekaterinburg is an interesting place. Their biggest tourist attraction is the Cathedral on the Blood. They've got that super dramatic history. It's the fourth largest city in Russia after Moscow and St. Petersburg and Novosibirsk. Yekaterinburg is technically in Siberia, although they don't like you to say that. They don't want it to sound that remote. They don't want to sound like they're way out there in the boonies. Don't say Siberia. But for Americans right now, Yekaterinburg has turned out to be of interest to us because Yekaterinburg is also home to the man who has proclaimed himself to be the representative of the Republic of California to Russia. Now, there is no Republic of California. There is a state of California. It's part of a larger country you might have heard of called the United States. But Russia apparently has a little gleam in its eye that if they play their cards right, maybe someday the United States of America might be slightly less united, and specifically, it might look more like this. Russia has a little gleam in its eye about the idea that the United States might somehow hive itself off from a state that alone represents the sixth largest economy in the world. Vladimir Putin is the founding patron of a generic-sounding group called the National Charity Foundation in Russia. Putin's National Charity Foundation funds something called the Anti-Globalist Movement of Russia. And some of the things the Anti-Globalist Movement of Russia does flash like red beacon danger, danger from an American perspective. For example, the anti-globalist movement from in Russia named Bashar al-Assad to be one of their honorary members. Oh, okay. They also named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Remember him? From Iran. They named him to be an honorary member. So those are the kinds of things the anti-globalist movement of Russia does that don't sit well with an American audience. But they also do stuff that's designed to seem more benign, or maybe even quirky and intriguing. That same group, the Anti-Globalist Movement of Russia, recently, last year, funded something called the Dialogue of Nations. It was a conference hosted in Moscow last year. And at that conference, they played down all the, supporting Assad, supporting Ahmadinejad stuff, to instead host this kind of quirky, good-natured assemblage of mini nationalist groups, mini independence movements from around the world. And one of the groups they hosted at their Dialogue of Nations conference was Yes, California. Yes, California. You heard about this after the election. They got a little flurry of attention after our presidential election here in November. California's legislature was getting a lot of attention for how that state might take an aggressive strategic approach to try to outflank the new Trump administration on policy stuff, particularly on immigration. But beyond that, there were also these almost human interest politics story about California seceding. Right, this new, tech-savvy, slick, kind of appealing, vaguely liberal-sounding Yes, California movement that was calling for California to not just resist the U.S. government under Trump, but for California to become its own country. And in fact, Yes, California submitted language to the California Secretary of State so they could start collecting signatures to get California secession on the ballot for the midterms for November 2018. They made Yes, California T-shirts. They started getting more and more media attention, more and more social media attention, more and more signups on their website. But then, you know what? It got weird. Our election was November. In December, this happened. They opened up an embassy for the Republic of California. See what it says right there under the word California? They opened up an embassy for the Republic of California in Moscow. And now, they interchangeably called it an embassy or a people's embassy or a culture center. But they took themselves very seriously about it. They put out this statement, quote, "Together with our partners at the Anti-Globalization Movement of Russia, our first culture center was opened at the following address." And then they give you that address. If you look up that address on Google Earth, it's not a scenic place, but it is a real place, really in Moscow. They also went on to give some odd assurances that you think they wouldn't have to reassure people about. Like this, quote, "Contrary to some reports, the California Culture Center and People's Embassy in Moscow does not serve any diplomatic function at this time. Our office makes clear that Russians planning to California must first obtain a visa through the American Embassy in Moscow or one of their consulates." They also want to make clear that they are not insisting that California should join the Russian Federation, like Crimea did. Oh, is that what Crimea did? They joined. That's what happened when they got invaded by Russia. From their perch in Moscow, the folks at Yes, California Said they explicitly, quote, support and encourage Californians to stand up and take direct action, to be bold, and to unapologetically demand the liberation of the people of California from its captors. Its captors being America. But again, they want to make clear, because apparently they think it's important to give this kind of assurance, they want to be clear that they are not asking for California to become part of the Russian Federation, and they're not asking for Russian military help, at least not yet.
So we're not requesting any kind of military assistance from Russia?
To separate California from America. That's not what we're doing now. So is this like weird turn of events, right? There's all this coverage in the United States how there's this odd progressive little secession movement in California in response to Donald Trump getting elected when California voted against him so strongly. But then that leader of the Yes California movement says he himself voted for Trump. And he does keep turning up in Russia. So, Putin's charity group funds this anti-globalization movement that funds this conference at which the Yes California guy shows up. Soon after the election, that also leads to the founding of a physical California embassy in Moscow, where they go out of their way to make clear they're not requesting Russian military intervention to break California off from the United States. But then it becomes clear that the Yes California guy was not just visiting Russia when he went to the initial Dialogue of Nations conference, nor was he just visiting when he appeared at the opening of the embassy. No, it turns out that he actually lives in Russia. He lives full-time and works full-time in Yekaterinburg in Russia. And now the story has come full circle. At least I hope this is full circle and it's not going to turn into a spiral. Because now the founder of the Yes California secession movement has announced that he is not coming back to the United States. He says, quote, I have found in Russia a new happiness. He says, quote, I had long planned to return to occupied California to struggle for her independence from the United States. But alas, now he says, quote, he does not plan to return to California in the foreseeable future. He says even though he still believes that California will someday achieve its independence from the United States, his group, Yes California, is withdrawing its ballot language now from the Secretary of State's office. And so basically that Yes California movement, the California secession movement under him, is now just this kid living in Yekaterinburg, Russia, happily as a Russian now. But nevertheless saying he plans to continue to serve as the representative of the Republic of California to Russia from his perch in Yekaterinburg. On the blood. So, consequences of this for us now. Number one, sorry to disappoint, California secession will likely not be on the ballot in November 2018. But this is also a good little display of how Russia funds stuff, how they do stuff in the world. I mean, Russia is playing all over the world, trying to get its way through all sorts of different means. And sometimes they just flat out openly give tons of money. Like, for example, what they did with Marine Le Pen, who's now in the running to be the very, 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 very far right-wing president of France, promising to take France both out of Europe and out of NATO, which would make Putin very happy. Russian banks have been happy to fund Marine Le Pen's French presidential campaign to the tune of millions of euros. And Vladimir Putin and Marine Le Pen have been happy to be seen together. That's quite out in the open. That's one way they do it. Sometimes it's not as out in the open. Sometimes it's more like the wacky Yes California thing, where you've got Putin as the patron of a charity, funding an organization, funding a conference, and then mysteriously something that looks like it's otherwise a quirky Facebook page or a sidebar human interest story in American politics ends up operating out of real free real estate in Moscow, running a fake embassy. At another level, another way that Putin gets his way and spreads his influence and uses money is through the oligarch system, which basically allows Putin to create proxies all over Russia and increasingly all over the world. If you are a Russian in Putin's favor, or he wants to co-opt you for his purposes, the typical pattern there would be for him to direct resources your way, to make state assets available to you. That's why, for example, we have like a Russian fertilizer oligarch and a Russian aluminum oligarch. These guys didn't work their way up in the fertilizer and aluminum industries or inherit these things from their dads, right? This is post-Soviet resource allocation from previously state-run enterprises. These guys were allowed to, were provided with the means to, take over big chunks of formerly state-run industries from the former Soviet era, as directed by and approved by Putin himself. So, for example, there's a group called the Siberian Energy Group. The Siberian Energy Group has obtained mineral rights and oil exploration licenses in a specific part of Siberia in Russia. You don't get that kind of thing without a very specific kind of permission in Russia. And that permission has direct and indirect consequences. It sets up, for example, the head of the Siberian Energy Group in terms of providing him with personal power and personal wealth. It also indirectly establishes yet another mysteriously wealthy Putin-connected businessman who sometimes seems to be tied to things that Putin wants to happen in the world. It's just sort of the traces that the oligarchs leave all over the world, right? The Siberian Energy Group, I highlight that group because they play a starring role in a scoop today at Politico.com. Politico has done a deep dive into the finances of the Siberian Energy Group and concluded, quote, Siberian Energy Group's dealings were characteristic of the equity trades, offshore financing schemes, and consulting agreements that Putin's allies have used to protect and hide assets. Politico is reporting on this particular trail of Putin money and Putin influence because it now appears to relate to the man you see on your screen here. It now appears to relate to the Trump White House, specifically to the former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. You remember that after Mike Flynn got fired as National Security Advisor, allegedly for not disclosing and then lying about the content of his communications with the Russian government, a few weeks after he got fired, he retroactively registered as a foreign agent who had been working on behalf of the government of Turkey. What Politico.com reports today is that while it is clear that Mike Flynn took money to act as a foreign agent, it's not clear that the origin of those funds is definitely Turkey. The head of that Siberian Energy Group is not a Turkish guy. He is, as Politico puts it, a Soviet-born former executive in Russian energy and mining companies, one who has ties to Vladimir Putin. He's not Turkish. He's not a Turkish citizen. He doesn't live in Turkey. He is not of Turkish ethnicity. He's not Turkish. He has nevertheless founded a couple of very Turkish-sounding organizations that operate in Washington, D.C., the Turkish Heritage Organization and the Turkish Institute for Progress, both of them set up by nobody Turkish. Both of them set up by a Russian energy and mining executive who has ties to Putin. Through those organizations, Politico reports today that he has coordinated what appear to be Turkish lobbying efforts in D.C. He appears to have coordinated those efforts with the guy who paid Flynn, with the guy whose shell company paid Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn over $600,000. So in addition to, we're talking about the guy who paid Flynn, in addition to his partnerships with the not at all Turkish guy who's close to Putin, who's running these Turkish lobbying efforts. The guy who paid Flynn himself also, it turns out, has his own business ties to Russia and to Putin, including pretty significant-sized aviation deals run through a Russian state-run bank that has been implicated in Russian intelligence operations in the past. And he has been involved in deals through that bank that have been proven to be signed off on by Putin himself personally, according to court documents reviewed by Isaac Arnsdorf at Politico. Politico reports that the multiple Putin connections to Flynn's foreign agent lobbying contract, quote, raise questions about both the agenda of the people who hired Flynn and, quote, the source of the funds used to pay him. So this is a remarkable thing, right? As we come up on this benchmark round number of 100 days at which we are supposed to assess how the president and his new administration is going. I mean, there remains, alongside everything else that's going on and everything else that's worth talking about in terms of how they're doing, there remains this very weird, very unprecedented thing about them firing the National Security Advisor after only 24 days on the job. It is still unexplained, and it is absolutely unprecedented that a National Security Advisor would be fired that soon and into an administration, that he would be fired for lying about his contacts with a foreign government, particularly after that foreign government had been publicly accused by the U.S. intelligence community of attacking our presidential election. It is as yet unexplained and totally unprecedented that the National Security Advisor would then retroactively register as having been on the payroll of a foreign government during the time he was advising the president and sitting in on the president's daily brief and getting supposedly vetted to be National Security Advisor. I mean, the unprecedented and strange and still unexplained nature of all of that goes to another level. If it now turns out that the money Mike Flynn was taking from foreign sources while Russia was attacking our country is in fact money that conceivably could have come from Russia, not from any other government. So that's all weird and unprecedented and as yet totally unexplained. People talk about getting to the bottom of the Trump-Russia connection. This is a big part of it. It's been weird from the very beginning. Today, though, the weird went pro, thanks to an unexpected formal inquiry. Right? Most of what we know about what happened with the Russian attack on our election and the links of people associated with the Trump campaign to the Russian government, that part of it in particular, most of what we know about that has been learned through investigative journalism. The government investigations into what happened, they are ongoing, but for lots of different reasons. They don't particularly inspire confidence right now. We've heard hide nor hair of the House Intelligence Committee investigation, since the Republican chairman of that committee recused himself from the investigation and himself became under investigation by the House Ethics Committee for his strange behavior toward the White House while he was supposedly running this investigation. That's in the House. On the Senate side, this week we have learned that they have assigned precisely 0 full-time staffers to work on their investigation. They've issued 0 subpoenas, they've made 0 requests for documents, and they have conducted no major interviews with anyone linked to Trump. Oh. That's what you've done with your more than 3 months working on this already. As for the Department of Justice and the FBI investigations, we learned last week that the chief of the National Security Division at Justice, a widely respected career official who's been overseeing those matters, she is now stepping down. We do not know who will replace her, but it will be a choice of the Trump administration, whoever it is. Tonight, the Senate confirmed a new Deputy Attorney General for the Justice Department as a whole. He will now oversee the investigations at even a higher level, at the highest level, because the Attorney General himself is recused from this matter, thanks to his own undisclosed ties to the Russian government. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein was confirmed by the Senate tonight. As a Trump administration appointee, he will now be the highest level of oversight over the Trump-Russia investigations, including those at the FBI, and it will be his call and his call alone as to whether or not there should instead be a special counsel conducting some of this investigation instead of keeping it in-house under his purview. So when those are the 3 levels of investigation going on inside the government, you can see why people who care very much about this story start to feel a little wobbly, right, about whether we're ever really going to get to the bottom of it. But now a whole different group, the House Oversight Committee. They jumped in. They have requested that they'd like to see the documents that Mike Flynn filed to up his security clearance when he came on board as National Security Advisor. What they found is absolutely fascinating. It may explain why Mike Flynn is asking for immunity already in exchange for his testimony on Trump and Russia. But the most amazing thing that they found was a total shock, totally unexpected, and something that I cannot believe will be allowed to stand. But that came directly from the White House, and that's next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.